In 2018, a Christian magazine did a study asking their respondents to pick one spiritual discipline in their life that they wished that they would improve. Over 90% of the respondents said prayer. Now, that might not surprise many of you because whether you've been a Christian for 1 year or 40 years, I think we would all agree that one area of our Christian walk that definitely probably needs to improve is our prayer life. In fact, there's a well-known theologian named D.A. Carson. And Carson was asked about prayer, and he said, if you want to embarrass the average Christian, just ask them about their private prayer life. We can probably point to a lot of passages of the Bible, and a lot of us could probably share an awesome evangelism story. But maybe some of us would be embarrassed when it comes to the reality of our private prayer life. And what's so scary about that is you and I understand the sentiment, right? That you and I cannot do what we need to do. We cannot be what we need to be without the power of God. And so that's why I think Luke, in both of his accounts, the Gospel of Luke and Acts, that he spent so much time emphasizing prayer in Jesus' ministry, but also in the ministry of the church. In fact, Luke is really trying to help us understand something that John 5:19 talks about, that Jesus only had his power because of what was given to him by the God above. And so Jesus' ministry at its core was not even of his own initiative. He depended himself on the power of God in him and through him. And that's why his ministry was able to succeed. It's through the power of God. In fact, if you open up your Bibles to Luke, what you'll find around every single corner, Jesus is praying at his baptism, at the temptations. We also notice that right before Jesus picks his disciples, he prays. We see this before he asks his disciples that important question, who do people say that I am? He prayed. And even when he wanted to get alone, he prayed. In fact, in Luke chapter 11, like we mentioned last week, his disciples asked him this question. Jesus, when we're looking at our life with you, there's one thing that we want to know. Can you please just teach us how to pray? Now, why would they pick that question? Because couldn't they have picked something else? Lord, teach us how to preach a great sermon. Lord, teach us how to, perform an awesome miracle. But the one thing that they picked over everything was prayer. I think they saw something in Jesus' life. And I think they saw something in their own. Prayer is the key to everything. And then we flip over to that next account that Luke wrote, the Acts of the Apostles. Prayer was the key to success for the church. It's why they grew. We see in Acts 1, it says that they were continuing to unite together in prayer. We see in Acts 2 and Acts 6 that prayer was the reason why they grew. And we also get to Acts chapter 9, and we see Peter himself praying for the sick. Acts chapter 11, we see the followers of Christ praying all night until Peter was released from prison. And then we get to Acts 16, Paul and Silas were praying when they felt alone and they felt abandoned. Prayer was foundational for the early church. And so here's my concern, that what was foundational for the early church has become something that is just now supplemental for today's church. In fact, have you ever noticed sometimes some of the prayer language we use? Well, there's nothing left to do except to pray. Well, I don't know what to do. I guess we're just going to pray. As if it's some last resort. Prayer for the early church was not a last resort. It was fundamental to everything that they were wanting to be and who they were. So why is it then that we don't pray? Well, maybe like last week, it's one of the reasons we mentioned is maybe for sometimes we look at where other people up on stage and they're praying using big fancy words that we've never heard of, and we just feel intimidated because we don't know some of those words or some of the terminology, so we just don't feel adequate enough to pray. Maybe for some of us what it is that we just don't have a self-discipline right now in our life to where we do it like we need to. But what we're going to deal with today, I would dare to say, is something that we've all struggled with. That maybe part of the reason that we don't pray is because for so long, some of our prayers have gone unanswered. In fact, one of the reasons why I know this is a big deal is because today we're going to look at two parables that Jesus teaches that deal with unanswered prayer. And what that tells us is not only did his disciples struggle with this, but he knew that one day we were going to struggle with it too. And so if you open up your Bibles today to Luke chapter 11, this is the very first parable that we're going to begin with, and then we're going to draw some application. And so in Luke chapter 11, of course, they're presenting Jesus with this question, Lord, will you please teach us how to pray? But what is it about prayer that they don't understand? What area of their prayer walk are they wanting to maybe get a better understanding of? Here's what we find out that it is. It's unanswered prayer. And the reason why we know that is because the parable that follows deals with unanswered prayer. I hope you can find a lot of encouragement in that. That he is showing us and saying to us, listen, if you have ever dealt with in your life, hey, God's never answered a prayer, or he hasn't answered the prayers that I want him to answer, that doesn't mean that you're odd. That doesn't mean that because you have doubt, God doesn't love you and that you're evil and he can't use somebody like you. Being that the disciples themselves asked this question and we're dealing with unanswered prayer in their life, I want you to understand that God can still use somebody like you that has questions when it comes to prayer. And so if you'll pick up with me in verse 5, that's where we're going to start today, in Luke chapter 11, verse 5, and this is what it says. And he said to them, which of you has a friend who will go to him at midnight and say to him, friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread, for a friend of mine has arrived on a journey and I have nothing to set before him. So evidently this friend pops up in the middle of the night and says, hey, I need a place to stay. And of course, he doesn't want to leave his friend hungry. And so that's the issue he's presented with. Now, this is well before the days of 24-hour grocery stores. And this is well before the day of Taco Bell and Fourth Meal. They might not have had Taco Bell. They might have had like Euro Bell. So there was no place to go to in the middle of the night. And this is also during the time where people really emphasized hospitality. So no good, hospitable person is going to send away a guest with an empty stomach. And so that's the situation he's in. He's got a friend that's hungry. He wants to be hospitable. Then you pick up in verse 7, it says this, and he will answer from within, do not bother me. The door is shut. And my children are in bed with me. I cannot get up and give you anything. Now, there's a few important details here about this text. This is during the day where there is no electricity. And so what that means is since they don't have electricity, they choose to go to bed when the sun goes down. So when it says that he shows up at midnight, please understand this guy is well into what we call REM sleep. He has been asleep, and he has been asleep for a long time. I don't know if you've ever been woken up in the middle of the night when you have reached that REM cycle. It's really hard to go back to sleep. Now, there's something else you probably notice in this text. It says that his kids were in bed with him. Now, that might sound a little odd, but this was during the days where there was no scene where you would be like, all right, kids, go to your room and go to bed. No, they were all in one room. Oftentimes, they would all share one bed together. Think Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right? Where they were all in that same room together. That's the situation here. And so not only when this guy knocks on the door is he waking you up, but he's likely waking the kids up. That's why I believe in this text he approaches him as friend, because could it be that their friendship is possibly on thin ice because this guy just woke him up and his kids in the middle of the night? Try getting several kids back to sleep, right? And then on top of that, his request is pretty odd. It's not, hey, I need you to come over and help me with something. My grandma fell and she's bleeding. That's not the request. The request is, hey, could you give me some bread? Bread is the request. Now, I do want you to notice, though, the request of bread is pretty extravagant because he asked for 3 loaves of bread. Their loaves of bread during this day were said to have been able to feed like 5 people. So he's also knocking on the door in the middle of the night asking for bread to feed 15 people. Again, before the days of Costco, he's not just going to, have probably, enough bread to feed 15 people just on standby. So this is a pretty extravagant request. And so continue reading in verse 8 with me at how he responds. He says, I tell you though, he will not get up and give him anything because he is his friend. Could possibly be because they're not friends anymore. I'm just kidding. But then it says this. But yet he does give it to him, and some texts use this word, because of his boldness or because of his shamelessness. Wow. I mean, that's pretty powerful. That the prayer or the request for food is being answered not because, hey, we're such great buddies. It's being answered. Why? Because of the boldness. Man, that really sticks out to me because I'm thinking, wow, a lot of the prayers that God has answered in my life, I can tell you, it's not because Andrew ITSON is such a great person. The reason why God has answered those prayers is because he is good, not because I'm such a good friend, because even at my best, you know how it is, we're all at our worst, and still God gives us good things, things that we don't even deserve. But if you notice in this text, there is a very important detail. It says, because of his persistent boldness, because he keeps coming to him over and over again. And that's reflected in the very next verse. He says, so the way to illustrate is this: ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. If you actually go back to some of the earlier translations of this text, they will add in this word. And some even talk about how it's actually in the original Greek, to keep asking, keep knocking, and keep seeking. Do you notice the persistence? Do you notice the persistent boldness that is being emphasized here by Jesus when we come before him with a request? Keep asking, keep knocking, keep seeking. I hope you can see what he's showing here. God delights in displaying his power to us, and especially to those who are bold enough just to ask him. So then we get to the next parable that he talks about unanswered prayer. And the fact that he uses two parables to talk about unanswered prayer tells me that a lot of people in their audience are just like us. We've had those times where we've prayed, but nothing's changed. So what about this parable? Well, let's begin in verse 1. It says, beginning in verse 1, and he told them a parable to the effect that they always ought to pray and not lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected man. And there was a widow in the city who kept coming to him asking, give me justice against my adversary. For a while he refused, but afterwards he said to himself, though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will give her justice, so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. And so then Jesus says something that kind of blows my mind. He says, this is like praying to God. Here's why this blows my mind. Whenever I read a parable, I probably do a lot of you do. I try to figure out two things. Who am I in the parable, and who is God? So who is God in this parable? Well, it's not the widow. And it's definitely not the judge, right? Because he is described as unrighteous and not a good judge. So who is God in this story? Well, as one person in the commentary put it, what Jesus is doing through this parable, he is likening it. And what he means by that, he's saying that if an unrighteous, terrible judge will give you what you need, don't you think an all-loving, all-knowing, powerful, caring God is going to give you what you need? And so what I want us to do is kind of build upon what we did last week. If you were with us last week, we talked about that prayer framework that we need when we approach Scripture, or when we approach God, and we're kind of wondering, well, I don't know what to pray, or maybe I've gone through a prayer rut. Well, now that we kind of understand what it is that we need to be praying to God, I want us to kind of build upon that by adding these four things that we can learn from both of these parables. Because even though the parables are different, these two parables emphasize these four main points that have got to be a part of our prayer life. And the first thing that I want to emphasize is this, that when we come before God, we have got to come before him desperately. Both of the characters in both of these stories are desperate. One of them is desperate because, they need a judge and they don't know where to find one. A judge that's going to give them and grant them the request that they want. The other person in this story that is desperate is this friend that is trying to feed another friend. He is desperate. Now, when we think of desperation, we oftentimes think of weakness. But when it comes to our relationship with God, if we are desperate for him and his power, it's actually one of the greatest strengths. In fact, sometimes our own independence is what can get in the way of an awesome prayer life and being desperate for a mighty move of God. In fact, one of the things that I know is that, when we think about how we are even today as Americans, we're very can-do people. That's why some people say that we're called, Americans, not Americans, because, we are people that like to do things ourselves. DIY network is extremely popular. Some of the most searched things on YouTube are those projects where we try to fix things ourselves. We love to do things ourselves. That's why there's a book for dummies on literally everything. And so it's awesome that we love to do things ourselves and to fix things ourselves. But the reality is sometimes that independence can actually get in the way of our prayer life. In fact, there's a guy named Paul Miller that wrote a book called The Prayer Life. And in that book, he made a statement that I've never thought about before. He said, if you don't have an in-depth prayer life and a meaningful prayer life with God where you come before him regularly, you actually might think that your power, your talent, your resources, your energy is enough. Now, I never would have thought about it like that, but the more I think about it, man, that's true. Because what I'm saying is, hey, I'm good on my own. Whether we realize it or not, maybe through our lack of a prayer life, we're telling God everything we really believe about Him and what we also believe about the gospel. That's why I notice in 1 Peter 5, something that we have to all understand, and it's this, is when you look in 1 Peter 5, Peter highlights that the reason why his power will come down upon us is when we humbly come before him in prayer. He exalts the humble prayer person. And so then it hits me, all right? The reason why I'm able to do anything is not because of my energy, resources, or whatever it is that I might have. See, a few years ago, we made the decision to adopt. And when we made that decision, the adoption agency that we worked with, they gave us this simple request. They said, we just want to encourage you to do two things before you adopt. We want you to pray, and we want you to read a lot of books on adoption. I am going to report to you that I did one of those two things. I read a lot of books on adoption. And I have to tell you, those books were awesome. I learned things that I never would have learned otherwise, and it opened my eyes to the adoption world in a way that I never had even thought about thinking of it. But the problem for me is I didn't pray as much as I should. And so while I had a lot of knowledge about certain things, the reality is that the power didn't come from my knowledge. The power for me to be the parent I needed to be is going to come from God. And the same thing for me and you is we're not going to be the best parents. We're not going to be the best spouses. We're not going to be the best workers because we're just so awesome and because we know all these things. So the power for us to do great things doesn't come from us tapping into our own potential, but tapping into God's. Do we humbly come before the Lord and let Him exalt us and help us to be what we need to be? See, I'm not able to be the husband I need to be because I'm just such a great husband and I know all the traits of a good husband. No, it's because of God working through me. That's why you notice in Scripture that Jesus doesn't save us by teaching us just about principles, but by giving us resurrection power. That's why one of the greatest tragedies for us is to master all the principles that God has given us, but yet we are not people that are being fully dependent upon Him. And so the first thing I think we can see from this text is we have to come before Him desperately. The second thing is this: we have got to come before Him boldly. Man, if you look at these requests, they are bold, they are extravagant. And so he says here, if this is how they come to a stingy friend or, an unrighteous judge, then how much more can we come before the Alpha, the Omega, the Creator, the Sustainer of the universe with our bold request? Well, what makes us feel like we can come boldly before the throne of God? Well, the very next illustration that is used here in this text makes it clear why you and I can be so bold, is because we are His children. See, children have certain rights that other people would not have. For example, one of the things that happens with our kids is something that probably happens with yours, is they get hungry at night, sometimes in the middle of the night, and they wake us up because they're thirsty or they want a snack. Now, I don't really enjoy waking up in the middle of the night, but I will give them a snack because they're hungry and I want to be a good parent, right? Now, imagine for just a second I get a knock on the door and it's 2 in the morning and it's Jonathan Kitchens. And Jonathan says, "Hey, Andrew, I was wanting to see if I could get some peanut butter crackers." Now, I love Jonathan, but I might be a little irritated that he asked for peanut butter crackers in the middle of the night. Now, I'll give him some peanut butter crackers if he really wants it, but I know Jonathan's not going to do that. Why? Because he understands that our relationship is not that of father and son. And so the reason why I give my kids those crackers is they are my children, but also, why do they do it? Because they feel that they can be bold. They feel like they can come before me and ask me of those things because we have that kind of relationship. It's kind of like back in the day when people would approach the throne room of a king. If you weren't a child of that king, certain traditions, you would have to come in and take your shoes off. Other traditions say that you have to put your head down and you can't even look at his throne. But did you know that kids could wear shoes inside the throne room? And kids could look at him in the face. And kids could even sit on his lap on that throne seat. Why? Because they had those kinds of privileges. And so that's why in this text in Luke chapter 11, he says, all right, think about it like this. If you who are a parent that desperately loves your child, and you love them probably next to the loving your God and loving your spouse, and you know how to give them good gifts, how much more does your Father? But notice what he says here in this text, a word I don't want you to miss. He says, if you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much does your good God, who is not evil, know how to give great gifts? Man, when I first read that, I'm like, wow, evil? Don't you think that's kind of a strong word? But it's true. That as sinful people, we still know how to give people what they need. How much more does your Father, who is pure, who is holy, who cares for you above everybody else, if he feels about you that way, how much more, do you believe that he's going to work in your life to give you those things that you really need? The third thing I want to draw your attention to in this text is the persistency of the prayer. If you look in chapter 11, verse 8, and in chapter 18, verse 5, it says this, because of the boldness or shamelessness. And then it says in chapter 18, verse 5, because of the continual coming. In Acts chapter 11, the church evidently gets wind that Peter is prison. And they want him to get out of prison. And so what they don't do is this. They don't say, all right, let's get together and have a prayer meeting for 15 minutes and everybody go back to their home. Actually, what you see is this. They prayed until he was released. I don't know if you've ever heard this acronym before. PUSH, pray until something happens. I think that's what's taking place here. But yet, how many times when we pray for something, we give up too soon? We say we speak where the Bible speaks and we're silent where the Bible's silent. I think we've been very silent on something the Bible has spoken on. Don't stop praying. Don't give up. Maybe some of you are in a situation where, you have a family member that's fallen away from the Lord. Don't give up praying for them. Maybe for some of you are going through a difficult time right now in your marriage, and it doesn't seem like there's a road to healing. Don't give up. Keep praying. In fact, God is glorified through our persistent boldness. And one of the pictures I see of that is when you get to the book of Exodus, and Moses is lifting up his hands, and the times that he's lifting up his hands is of course, the time that they're experiencing victory. We see that connection with God is when victory is happening, but the moment he puts his arms down, they're defenseless. And I think about that, and by the way, I've always thought it was funny, what if he started doing jumping jacks? That would have really thrown him off. But, when we're in connection with God, when we're being open to what he can give us, we are experiencing power. Don't give up. Keep your hands lifted up. Keep your heart attuned with God. Be persistent in your prayers. God's not annoyed by it. God is not bothered by it, but he is actually glorified through it. The final thing I want to encourage you with this morning in your prayer life is to trust. And I know that's one thing that may be easy to say, but a whole difficult thing to do, because I think what this text is acknowledging is this tough reality that sometimes we don't get the answers we want. And even though I know this does not take the pain of your unanswered prayer away, not only do we not get things that we want, but sometimes he'll give us what we need, and that is still hard. That we may not get the answers we want, but we also may not get the answer that we feel like from our perspective that we need. Well, what God then? Well, what I think this text is illustrating us is that we can still trust God because he is still working out his greater plan. And so the example that he gives is this. He says, imagine for a second that your kid puts his hand out. And when he puts his hand out, he says, hey, mom, hey, dad, I want a fish. Well, instead of giving a fish, you give him a scorpion. Well, no good parent is going to do that, right? Your kid asks for a chicken nugget. You're not going to give them a scorpion. You're going to give them something. It may not be a chicken nugget, but you're going to give them something that they need that is sustaining. We'll flip that around for just a second. Imagine that your child asks for a scorpion. Would you give your child a scorpion? No. Well, what if they said, pretty please, 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 please give me a scorpion? No. Well, what if they said, mom and dad, I'll put the scorpion on a leash and I'll walk it around the house? No. Because in their mind, what they think is that the scorpion is exactly what they need. But they also don't see the dangers that the scorpion would give them. And so that's the picture of what happens at times with us, that we go through life. We think we know what we need, but God actually sees the greater plan. In fact, on this last slide, what you're going to see is one of my favorite quotes that J.D. Greear says. And I've held on to this for me during times of unanswered prayer. And this is what it says. Sometimes God answers our prayers by giving us what we would have asked for if we knew what he knew.
Hey, this is Scott Patterson, and I want to thank you so much for joining us for our Winning Wednesdays lesson. And I hope you were encouraged and uplifted by that lesson. But you may be sitting here thinking, I think I need to respond to what was said tonight. And if you need to respond, here's how you can reach out. You can call me at 803-257-3880. You can reach out to our involvement minister, Jeremy Hynode, at 706-830-3229. Or you can reach out to our youth minister, Sam, at 423-779-6586. You can also email us generally at secretary@visitcentral.org, or you can email me personally at minister@visitcentral.org. Again, thank you so much for joining us for this Winning Wednesdays lesson. And if you need to respond, please do, and we'll reach out to you straight away. Thank you.